you feel like map system changes are not as fun as item rune changes? I feel like the game is the same for the last 2 years. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily agree with you that the game is the exact same. I do think from a player perspective, some of the more exciting things often come to like, how does my champion change? I think a lot of players, they tend to focus on the game in a very champion-centric kind of view. And so a lot of map changes, they don't necessarily make your champion feel any different, even if they could be like cool or fun. Whereas like a new item could very easily make your champion feel very different, or a different rune might be very interesting to the champion. So in regards to game systems, I do kind of agree that like the ones that are like directly on champions tend to be the ones that a lot of players find compelling. But it doesn't mean that map changes aren't cool or fun or good or anything like that. As an example of a map change that we did years ago that I absolutely loved would be plants. I think plants like massively like revolutionized the game in really good. Sorry, I shouldn't say revolutionized. Like improved the game in like really awesome ways. And that would be like be a map change, right? So like the funny thing about plants is when plants came out, like when plants were like being like on the PBE and they came out, the initial player response is these size things are like super lame and gimmicky before anybody got to play them. Like players like kind of like looked at plants and they were like, there's a lot of people saying like these are just a big gimmick and they're lame and like why would you do these? And then people actually got to play them and it was like, oh, these are super cool.
Is that what you guys are up to at the office? Have there been any topics brought up that were like, obviously we would never do this unless it actually made it to live? Oh, for sure, yeah. I think like Nautilus Jungle is a good example of this. I think a lot of people were pretty skeptical on Nautilus Jungle of like, can we actually do this? And then we just kind of shipped it, you know, and that's fine. Like I'm happy to do that. One thing I will say is like, people do take the things that I say and as like, oh, you know, like even if I'm not saying we will never do this, and I just say like I don't think we would do this, or like I don't think this is good, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone else agrees with me, right? Like Riot gives a lot of individual agency to designers. If you own something, you're really given a lot of freedom to do that thing the way that you see fit. And I think that does a lot of good for projects where, hey, you own this project, therefore you don't have to deal with, you know, 12 other designers telling you that you're not allowed to buff this thing or you're not allowed to ship this thing. It's like, does it mean that we sometimes ship things that like people saw coming like that weren't good? Yeah, it does. But it also means that designers are really like empowered to actually take risks and ship things that have really high upside, right? Like as an example, you know, from something in the past, is like I did not think ZERI was something that we should ship or that we should have locked the kit that ZERI had when she got her kit locked, and I think I've been pretty validated by all the things that I said and like the way that ZERI turned out on live. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I think that we should have a structure where like I could have just said, August, you can't ship this. Right? It's like I think it was fine that he was willing to take that risk, and it didn't play out in ZERI's case, I would say, super well. Obviously, she needed a lot of changes to even be like a real champion in League of Legends. But overall, though, I think that structure makes a lot more sense than a really risk-averse structure, because as this is a famous quote by Mark Rosewater, who's I think maybe the world's most famous game designer. He's like the lead designer of Magic. Is you should always be more afraid of boring your players than anything else. Or I don't remember the exact statement. It's basically like you don't want to like you can't get your game into a state where you're never taking risks. Basically, that just isn't going to work. Right? That's when you release stuff like Homelands and Magic. It's like, oh, we didn't take any risks. Also, this set is boring. Right? There's nothing interesting about this because we took no risks. Right? So. I think it's good that we're willing to take risks, even if, sometimes it's risks that people did, correctly predict would not play out correctly. This might be obvious, but is balancing items way harder than balancing champs? Have you ever been in a situation where this is not the case? I think balancing items on average is harder than balancing champions because, number one, items have fewer levers than champions do. Number two, balancing an item means that you're going to affect a large number of champions that you have to consider. Whereas, when you're changing a champion, the only champion that's going to be affected is that champion specifically. So your changes are less localized. So you have to consider all of the ramifications of changing an item when you do that. Who you're going to be buffing, who you're going to be nerfing indirectly, and whether you're going to enable new builds. And third, the combinatorics of items mean that changes you make to items to balance them don't always do what you want. Like sometimes, like a great example of this from the past is CAITYLN was buying Runons and stacking her headshot really quickly, and we're like, oh man, this is really messed up, right? This was many years ago. I think this was like season 7 maybe, I don't remember. This is a long time ago, but CAITYLN was buying Runons. Maybe it was season 6, doesn't matter. Caitlyn was buying Runons, and because her Runons bolts were stacking her headshot, and so the idea was like, oh, I stack up a bunch of, like, I get Runons because it lets me headshot people a lot more frequently in team fights, and that makes me do a lot more damage. And we decided to remove this as a balance change to Runons as an example. And you know what that did? Caitlyn's win rate actually went up because people stopped buying Runons, which it actually turned out wasn't that good, and people started doing the double Energizer build, which is at the time the RFC Shiv build, which was just better. Like, it was more win rate, and it was like pretty clearly just more powerful in every way, because it turns out that pot-shotting people for massive damage consistently and just having a really consistent output was way more powerful than sometimes getting your headshot more frequently and having a little bit more sustained DPS in cases where you were able to get all your Runons bolts off, right? So there's just so many more things that happen when you that can happen when you change items than when you change a champion. It's very rare that you get like super deeply off outcomes when you change a champion. Like, obviously when you do like a mid scope or whatever, that happens from time to time. But when you change an item, because there's so many champions that are going to be affected by almost any item that you change, you're almost always going to get some outcome that you weren't really expecting, unless you're literally saying like plus 5 AD or, you know, minus 100 gold cost. Like, even small things, like for example, changing Catalyst earlier this year to have 2 Ruby Crystals in the build path, that had a lot of knock-on effects, a lot of consequences for the game that we didn't really anticipate at the time. The expectation was that it wouldn't make Rod of Ages significantly more popular, because it was like, well, it doesn't even change the final item. It's just making a Catalyst a little bit better to build to. It doesn't change Catalyst at all. But suddenly we started seeing everyone building Rod of Ages, right? Because, you know, and maybe it was the case that that was already optimal, and we just changed the psychology of it. Like, oh, I can buy double Ruby Crystal now, or I see other people buying double Ruby Crystal. This is great. Therefore, you know, I'm going to start buying this. But you have to consider those kind of psychological impacts as well as actual impacts every time you change items. So it is very difficult to tune items, I would say, overall.
Why did Riot never experiment with a limited champion pool queue that would change weekly? Yeah, so honestly, good question, and I'll give you a good answer as a reward for your good question. A common misconception for players is that you can just make as many queues as you want, and it's like not an issue. Like, kind of the idea that's like, well, who cares how even good it is? As long as some people like it, why not just make it, right? Like, you know, if people want to play that thing, let them play it, right? The hard part about that is every single time you make a queue, you split the population of your players. And that can be bad for 2 specific reasons. One is all the other queues get less healthy, meaning that every queue we make in some way takes away from all the others. Unless, of course, that queue just has players that would never play in the other queues. So the more queues you have, the more players you just need in general to make it work. The other problem is that for a game like League of Legends, League relies on good matchmaking to make the game actually like enjoyable. League, when the matchmaking is bad, is not that great of an experience. And so one of the problems with any like extra queue you make is it's not just about the fact that it can dilute your queues and make the other queues worse, but if it can't hold a minimum population, it will also be a bad experience. And so that's the other thing you have to care about, is any queue you make has to be worth diluting the other queues and hold a minimum population. Otherwise, it will basically just become a bad experience because of either because it'll be forced into bad matchmaking or bad queue times if its population is too low. So if you're always wondering, like, well, why does it matter that not very many people played Nexus Blitz? If some people liked it, like, why don't you just keep it online? And the problem is that you need enough people to support a healthy queue. That's how Twisted Treeline ended up, right? I remember matches feeling super unbalanced last stretch. Yeah, so, like, the reason we removed Dominion and the reason we removed Twisted Treeline is because their queues were just really, really, really unhealthy because almost no one played them. And so at some point, the best thing to do for those queues was to, you know, take them out back, right? Because there just wasn't enough people playing them to support healthy queue times and, you know, quality matchmaking.